In 1914, the threat of World War would be realized, and the United States would find themselves in a position where the war was eventually inevitable. The United States may not have joined in on the war right away, but realizing the war was coming, women in the Remington Arms Factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut would use their position of power to argue for an 8-hour workday and for equal pay. With the start of World War I and the various other wars going on throughout Europe at the time, the small town of Bridgeport, Connecticut would eventually turn into a boom town that was in dire need of labor. In the midst of this need for labor, and as the desperation grew for willing workers, many of the factories would hire anyone they could get their hands on, including women. By hiring these women, the factories were able to achieve quick and inexpensive labor while not needing any traditional manpower. Factories would work these women all day, every day for arduous hours, and they would often be doing back-breaking labor for minimal pay, all because they were women. However, one summer day in 1950, in the small town of Bridgeport, Connecticut, thousands of women would walk out on their jobs and would go on strike for hours. Knowing that their labor was needed in the factories at the time, these women were able to go on strike and have their voices heard, which would eventually light the spark that would lead to a frontier not only for women in Connecticut, but for women in the United States as a whole. With the economic boom that had occurred as a result of World War I in the United States, the population of Bridgeport, Connecticut would grow by upwards of 25% in a relatively short amount of time. With this drastic increase in numbers and the need to support a nation at war, women in the workplace were not only a recommendation, but would eventually become a necessity if one were wanting to succeed. At the time of 1915, women seen working in the factories, working what was a traditionally masculine job, was seen as taboo. Just a few years before, in 1913, the population of workers in Bridgeport had reached just south of 170,000 people, but only a minuscule number of these were women, only around 43,000. Needless to say, there is very little female representation in all jobs, let alone in factories. As the war would drag on, the United States would eventually join in 1917, and the numbers would reflect this. The number of workers would rise to over 350,000, with over 25% of those being women. Needless to say, the number of women that were out and working for their nation was growing at a rapid rate. However, with the growing number of women also came certain restrictions. Women were allowed in the workforce and were allowed to work in factories, as the United States needed their men overseas, but the women were still heavily restricted and were often supervised by older men not in the military. Despite their patriotism and working for their country, the women in Connecticut were still working the same dangerous jobs as a man, but were getting paid much less. One day, fed up by the working conditions and lack of pay, women of the Remington Arms Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut would walk out and go on strike. These women would remain outside, not doing their crucial work for hours at a time. At the time, the absolute absurdity of this situation was completely unheard of. This can be seen by how certain people would respond to this at the time. An example of how these strikes were generally seen by the public can be voiced by the founder of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers. Gompers would claim that the situation that was occurring in Bridgeport with all of the strikes was due to foreign powers who were trying to disrupt the manufacturing rates and shipment of goods from America to Europe. Gompers would go on to state that he feels absolutely no sympathy towards the strike's cause and would simply brush it off as a matter of foreign propaganda. Many men, including Samuel Gompers, would never see the strikes as what they were, an attempt to create the very frontier that would strive for women's equality and a frontier for women's suffrage. These people, with their fixed mindset on the problem, were the very thing that the women were trying to overcome and fight against. Gompers would say that the women strike leaders should be driven out of the country and never allowed to return. He would even go on to describe these strike leaders as being a constant menace to the industrial peace and the welfare of the American working man. Despite public opinion being largely against them and the rough conditions that they face every day in the factories, these women in Bridgeport would keep on fighting for the 8-hour workday. These women, who were just in a small factory in the middle of Bridgeport, Connecticut, would eventually walk out on their jobs and go on strike for what they believed, which in turn would inspire other women to do the same. Some of these women include women from the Colt Manufacturing Company and the International Silver Company, also in Connecticut. These women would also inspire over 600 others to quit their job at the Bryant Electric Company in order to argue for a minimum wage of $6. These women in Connecticut, specifically Bridgeport, Connecticut, would create a frontier for women all over the country, and their ideas would spread fast. Because of the strikes displayed by women in these factories, the League of Women's Voters in Connecticut would form as offspring of the CWSA, or the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association. Connecticut would go on to ratify the 19th Amendment on September 14, 1920, and the League of Women's Voters would follow soon after, on January 18, 1921. Because the women in Bridgeport were brave enough to go on strike and argue for an 8-hour workday for themselves, they would ignite a spark that would eventually spread throughout Connecticut and eventually the entirety of the U.S. that would serve as a frontier for women's suffrage.